Hey everyone, this is James from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So today it is a episode that has been much requested. I'm going to be talking about different recommended vendors. So thank you to Scupson and Celeron on YouTube comments for requesting the episode. It's a good idea. It's one that I think I've done in the past. I've also written articles on this. But it's one that, helps to kind of revisit and see how we feel now in 2024 versus in the past. And in many ways, I'm actually probably a little less qualified to talk about these things. So I'm going to just be very clear about this. This is very much my point of view. And if someone were to ask me the question of where to get tea for Pu'erh specifically, I would kind of point you to these different ways, and so it's to my best understanding. I'm not going to say I've sampled 100 of teas from each vendor. That's just frankly untrue. So while I have done those exercises in the past, I don't intend to do it now. This is just kind of the exercise if someone asks me the question. So take from that what you will. I don't want to overstate kind of my authority here. I certainly buy quite a bit less tea than I used to, certainly 10 years ago, but even 5 or 6 years ago. I just don't have a ton of different purchases there. So this is, it's a list that I don't claim to be comprehensive. And so if you want to explore other vendors, which I'm sure there are plenty of other good vendors that are not listed on this list, you're certainly welcome to. I'm just not the guy for it that I may have once tried to be. And it's totally possible that I may change my opinion in the future too. This is just where I currently feel and where I would look currently. So with all those caveats, let's get onto it too. I think one important thing to think about when we're thinking about this too is goals on the type of teas that you want to try. You don't need to buy from 20 different vendors. In fact, you're going to likely settle on a few that fit what you're looking for. And those are kind of your vendors that you're buying from kind of long term. And a lot of that depends on what type of teas I like. Does that vendor specialize in that type of tea? How do I like this certain category of tea? Did this vendor say something that pissed me off on Reddit? Or am I okay with this vendor's personality? So, a lot of those are personal decisions and things like that. So I think it's fine if people settle on different vendors and things and whatever, but most likely you are not going to be sampling from 10 to 20 vendors when you are in year 2 or 3 of your tea exploration. You're probably going to settle on, somewhere between 1 and 5 that you like. And occasionally you might buy from someone else, but for the most part, it's just a couple. And that's more or less kind of what's happened to my own preferences too. Buying even less tea than before now. So, tea purchases might just be like between 2 and 5 a year. So yes, think about the categories of teas you want to try. Do you want to try young raw pu'erh? Do you want to try semi-aged tea? And what type of semi-aged tea do you want to try? Aged tea, aged raw pu'erh, how do you want that to be aged? Do you want it to be traditionally stored? Do you want something a little bit drier, more kunming? Ripe tea, do you want traditionally stored ripe tea? These, so I've done episodes in the past of kind of the different categories of raw pu'erh to try and the different categories of ripe pu'erh to try. I'd encourage people to watch that video because I think it really encourages people to kind of break it down and take a look at what you're after. Because if you're going to sample stuff very randomly, based on the vendor, you're likely going to end up in a place where you are drinking a lot of different young raw pu'erh. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. You'll get a great feel for kind of what people are marketing as different areas and regions and things like that. But you're going to get a very limited view of that. It's going to be a little bit myopic. You would benefit quite a bit from trying different categories, especially if you've never tried them before. So I like to encourage people to sample a little more broadly than just kind of buying randomly. So, you can certainly get sucked into trying different areas and regions. But for myself, I know that would be a poor approach because I don't especially like young raw pu'erh. And so if I were to neglect the other categories in favor of that, it would be kind of suboptimal in a certain way. Okay, so let's just get on to the different vendors. And perhaps it'll be no surprise that I'm going to list first Unon Sourcing. And I think this vendor gets a little bit more hate than it probably deserves from a lot of people that haven't tried it. In my opinion, Unon Sourcing, and I didn't always feel this way, is a little bit more curated than you'd think. They certainly have a lot of young raw pu'erh, but they have a lot of everything. And I think even their most of their teas are tried by Scott and scouted out by them, and I think he has generally a pretty solid taste. Of course, not everything is going to be everyone's to taste, but if you're wanting to try just a wide variety of tea, you can buy young tea from him. You can buy semi-aged tea that's been stored in kunming, so a little on the drier end. But he's also been very specific to source teas that have been stored in alternate storages too. And so even though, his background might be a little bit more based in Yunnan, so be a little bit more dry, that doesn't mean you can't try teas that have been stored from other locations than kunming. So I found that he's pretty good for that. HT, you're going to get a little bit sparser, but he does have a couple there. Traditionally stored tea, you're probably not going to find true kind of Hong Kong traditionally stored tea there, but most vendors you're not either. Scott also sources a lot of ripe. So really the only category you're missing here are kind of like the more, some aged tea. I would say he's a little limited there, and the traditionally stored ones. So it's a great place to start and a great place to try a lot of different teas, things that are interesting to you. He's also always been pretty good about kind of giving his own recommendations. So if you wanted to try a bunch of different Iwu teas, it's good to try it that way too. Next up, I have, unsurprisingly, two white tea. So these two, if I made this list in 2016, 2017, I probably would have listed them here too. This is a vendor that has become increasingly focused on newer tea. I found that most new vendors kind of get sucked into that thing. I think maybe business-wise it makes a little bit more sense rather than trying to source kind of these more semi-aged or aged teas. I'm not totally sure why that is, but I think part of it might just be it's easier. It's a little different business model in terms of forming new connections and things like that. They also have pretty solid ripe. Someone I would probably look to mostly just for their young raw pu'erh, young to relatively young raw pu'erh. They have some that's getting a little semi-aged, not significantly though in my opinion, and ripe. So they'll sell some HAs and some other stuff like that. Same with Unon Sourcing, but for the most part that is kind of their bread and butter. So if you want to try kind of the range of young raw, I think they're a pretty good vendor, and they're a highly controversial one just because of kind of their name. Some people find them pretentious, some people find them overpriced, but I've always found them to be fine. I'm not going to say they're like a great bargain bin vendor or anything like that, but I've never had a huge issue with the prices they're charging. There's a huge range in sort of the tea that they are offering. Okay, third up, and this is a vendor that has been around a little bit less long than those two, but probably won't be surprising too, is Teas We Like. I like Teas We Like quite a bit. I think they are really good, and they fill in a lot of the different gaps that those first two vendors do not. In fact, they are very, very curated. So these teas, I would say, are curated on another level. It's a little bit less user-friendly in terms of sampling and things like that, but you can still buy quarter cakes and whatnot. And the quality and the types of tea they focus on very, very closely aligns to what is personally interesting to me too. So storage-wise, you're going to get some Taiwan storage. You're also interestingly going to get some Malaysian storage stuff, which is one of those storages you'll often hear about, but it's actually kind of hard to find. From different vendors. Essence of Tea at different points has had some Malaysian stored tea, but Teas We Like has some really solid connections there, so they are a good place. They're also kind of more of, at least my understanding of it, more of a side business, so I think that can help to lower those margins for these semi-aged teas and make them a little bit reasonable. Tea prices can escalate really, really fast when, let's say, we find a tea in Taiwan that we want to store, and it's okay, great, it's $90. But to make it worth your while as a vendor to sell that, especially if it's your sole source of income, you probably are going to need to mark that up to over $200. I would be kind of surprised if it was marked up much less, unless you are doing sort of the side business style. And I think I don't know exactly what Teas We Like markups are, but I do, from what I've seen, they seem to be fairly reasonable there. Of course, the same is true for all vendors. I'm not going to agree with the taste of theirs 100% of the time, but I think if you're looking for really quality old tea, so old Heicha, as well as older, semi-aged to older Pu'erh, then they are very good. Young, they're going to have a little bit less selection, but you know what? We have so many vendors focused on young that you don't necessarily need that, and they do have some pretty high-quality young stuff too. So this is kind of the one you would look at if you want something. I would say they focus on a little bit higher price range than the other ones, which they'll have teas at that price range, but Teas We Like, I'd say, is a little more focused there. So highly recommend Teas We Like too, if that sounds interesting or not. Again, it's focused on a little bit different of a range, and I really appreciate how they have kind of focused away from what other new vendors are focusing on, meaning more of like the young tea. It's like, oh yeah, we have this great farmer connection. It's less of that and more of like, okay, we're trying to kind of hunt and find these different like both boutique and factory teas that already have a good deal of age under their belt too. Okay, so next up, and this is a very specific recommendation, is Yunnan Tea. They are a specialist in kind of like the Hong Kong traditional storage. This is certainly not going to be for everyone. I am personally a Hong Kong traditional storage fan, so I really like having access to their teas, and I have yet to find another vendor that kind of offers that sort of access. For me, I like their daily drinking teas, so Best Taste, Purple. I've been shouting those out for a while, but I'm certainly not alone there. Their premium teas I think you'll find to be a little bit more hit or miss. But I think if you're looking for traditionally stored raw and ripe and you want to get good benchmarks, they're a pretty good vendor, and they're definitely the one I would recommend that you can buy from online, because, a lot of people aren't necessarily focusing on that. Occasionally, I think maybe Teas We Like might have a traditionally stored tea or two. White tea occasionally has had in the past, but I would not even bother with those when you have an option like Yunnan, where it's kind of their house storage. They are actually the vendor that's storing a lot of these teas too. So definitely recommend them. Less to say, just because they are very focused on just those types of tea. I wouldn't necessarily buy their younger tea or anything like that, but they are Hong Kong based too. Okay, so just real quickly wanted to run through the stateside ones. I'm not familiar with the European vendors, so I'm not even going to try to touch base on the ones if you wanted to buy within the EU or whatever. So Unon Sourcing.us. Basically, Unon Sourcing Lite, the prices are just a little bit higher, but you're going to get fast shipping, potentially free shipping too if you order a certain amount. I actually do most of my Unon Sourcing ordering from the US site too, just because the selection is good enough for me. He's pretty good about carrying his own brand cakes, which, I drink through pretty regularly. So I recommend them. There's, a moderate amount of tea where it's not quite the warehouse that you're going to get from the Kunming based site, but it's good enough. Next up is Bana tea. This is kind of the Teas We Like that's based stateside. I'd say they lean towards the more curated, higher end teas. I have not looked closely at their prices these days, but I'd imagine they've gone up. Linda Louie, who is a really nice lady, has connections with Vesper Chan of Best Tea House in Hong Kong. So they're going to get a variety of teas from them, including some very, very high-end stuff. And so if you really wanted to order domestically and not from international, because all three of those other vendors I've mentioned at the top are either based in China or Taiwan, then Bana Tea was probably who I would shout out to. And Crimson Lotus too. So they're kind of like in that kind of white tea mode of domestic vendors. They're based in the US. I'm sure I'm missing plenty of vendors, and probably some people will be annoyed, but this is to my knowledge, and these are the ones that, I feel like I know enough about to really solidly recommend. So yeah, Crimson Lotus, they're nice people. They're based in Seattle, and they do kind of a lot of young raw, as well as, a fair amount of ripe. So if you wanted to just dip your feet in and try those different things and order from a domestic vendor, I would definitely recommend them too. I think people generally will have fairly solid experiences from all these places, depending on what you're after. So yeah, think about those different categories of tea, what you're looking to try. I would recommend people, especially if they're newer to Pu'erh, to try all six if you can. So that might take a little bit of time, but you can be patient. All of these vendors, with the exception of Teas We Like, are pretty consistent about offering different samples. And even Teas We Like, I think there are ways to be, to order according to your interest too. Okay, so let me know if you like that episode, if that satisfied everyone. I apologize, I'm not going to be doing an Yixing episode. I've not bought an Yixing pot in probably 10 years or so. I also don't care that much about clay, maybe compared to the average tea aficionado in the West, so sorry. it's just not going to happen. I feel a lot more qualified to talk about the different vendors and things like that than I do teaware. So thank you all for tuning in. I will see you all next time. Cheers.